Mm-hmm. I stared at the message for a long time, long enough that my coffee went cold on the counter beside me and I didn't even notice. Outside, Christmas lights blinked across the neighborhood in soft red and green patterns, while I stood frozen in my kitchen, reading the same text over and over again. Dad, we talked it over and we think it's better if this year you celebrate Christmas on your own. 34 years old. That's how old my son Nathan was when he decided I no longer belonged at his family's Christmas table. Funny thing is, I had practically been paying for the table. The mortgage on their house? Mine. Their car payments? Mine too. Private school for my grandson Elliot? Also me. By the time I sat down with a legal pad and added everything together, I realized I'd been spending close to $90,000 a year supporting Nathan and his wife Diane. $90,000 to be told I should spend Christmas alone. But anger wasn't the first thing I felt. Embarrassment was. A deep kind of embarrassment that settles into your chest when you suddenly realize everyone else understood something before you did. I kept wondering if they'd already discussed this with friends. Maybe Diane's parents. Maybe neighbors. Maybe they laughed about finally setting boundaries with the generous old man who paid their bills. I stood there staring through the kitchen window while lights flashed across the glass, and for the first time in years I felt foolish. My wife Pauline used to warn me about this. Not directly. She was gentler than that. But after she passed from pancreatic cancer 6 years earlier, I started using money the way other people use conversation. Every check I wrote felt like proof I still mattered. Every bill I covered felt like a way to stay connected to my son and grandchildren. I told myself it was for family. Truth was, it was easier than admitting Nathan and I barely knew how to talk to each other anymore. So that Tuesday night, instead of calling him, I opened my banking app. I canceled the mortgage payment first, then Nathan's car, then Diane's. I removed Nathan from my insurance plan and reported Diane's emergency credit card lost, so it would stop working within the hour. The only thing I didn't touch was Elliot's tuition. A 7-year-old boy shouldn't pay for adult behavior. After that, I sat alone at the kitchen table with fresh coffee, and a silence so heavy it almost felt physical. And the strangest part? I didn't feel powerful. I felt tired. Because deep down I knew this hadn't started with one text message. It had started years earlier, with every uncomfortable conversation I avoided. Every time I chose money over honesty. Every time I convinced myself that being useful was the same thing as being loved. If you've ever spent years giving everything to people who slowly stopped seeing your value, subscribe. Because some lessons arrive quietly, and by the time they do, they've already changed your life. The next morning I called my attorney, and by Thursday afternoon, my son received a certified letter informing him that the house he lived in was officially going up for sale. Nathan called me Friday morning at exactly 7:52. I remember the time because I was standing at the kitchen counter, eating toast and watching birds circle the feeder outside my back window, when my phone started vibrating across the table. I looked at the screen. Nathan! For a moment I just stared at it ringing. Then I let it go to voicemail. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply wasn't ready to hear panic in my son's voice while holding half a piece of buttered toast. Some conversations deserve steadier hands than that. He called again 20 minutes later. Then Diane called. Then Nathan 3 more times in a row. By the time I came back from my morning walk, there were 14 missed calls waiting for me, along with a voicemail from Diane's mother, Ellen, who had apparently decided my finances were now a community discussion. There was even a message from one of Nathan's friends telling me I was overreacting. That one actually made me laugh. People are very generous with opinions when the money being spent isn't theirs. I sat in my living room for almost an hour before finally calling Nathan back. He answered immediately. "Dad, what is going on?" he said, breathless. "Why did we get a legal letter?" "Because I sent one." A long silence followed. Then came the anger. "You're seriously selling the house right before Christmas? What are we supposed to do?" I leaned back in my chair and looked at the blinking lights on my tree. "I don't know, Nathan," I said calmly. "What exactly was your plan for me on Christmas?" "That's different." "No," I replied quietly. "It really isn't." He started talking faster after that. About the kids. About school districts. About how impossible it would be to move in the middle of the year. And I listened. I really did. Because despite everything, I loved my son enough to hear the fear underneath his frustration. When he finally paused, I told him something I hadn't planned to say. I didn't cancel Elliot's tuition. Silence again. He's 7 years old, I continued. None of this belongs to him. Something in Nathan's tone changed after that. Not completely, but enough for me to hear it. The anger softened just slightly, and underneath it I caught something I hadn't heard from him in years. Shame. I explained everything clearly after that. The mortgage, the insurance, the cars, the constant expenses they had accepted without ever acknowledging what it cost me financially or emotionally. Then I said the thing I'd probably needed to say years earlier. When someone tells you to spend Christmas alone while sitting inside a house you pay for, eventually you have to stop pretending that arrangement makes sense. He didn't argue with that. Instead, he said quietly, "Diane is freaking out right now." I imagine she is. Another silence. Then, in a voice so small it barely sounded like the same man, Nathan said, "I honestly didn't think about how the message would sound." "I know," I told him, and somehow that hurt more than if he'd meant it. Because thoughtlessness can cut deeper than cruelty. Cruelty at least requires intention. I gave them 60 days, more than the law required. I even offered to help them figure out finances, budgeting, and housing options if they wanted advice. That part almost made me smile. After years of funding their lives, suddenly my actual experience as a structural engineer and financial planner might finally become useful to them. Before we hung up, I told him I loved him. The words felt strange in the silence between us. Heavy, important. Nathan didn't say it back. Not then, but for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel desperate for the response. That week became messy fast. Relatives I barely knew suddenly had opinions about my morality. Diane's mother left more voicemails. A cousin I'd never even met sent me a Facebook message calling me vindictive. It amazed me how quickly people appear when there's money involved. But through all of it, I kept thinking about Pauline, about the way she used to handle difficult moments without raising her voice once. She always said something simple whenever people crossed a line. "You've wandered into a room that isn't yours." I finally understood what she meant. Because for years, I had allowed too many people into rooms that belonged to my peace, my finances, and my self-respect. And once I closed that door, everyone panicked. If you've ever had people disappear the moment you stopped giving them access to your wallet, subscribe. Because sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is learn the difference between being loved and being used. 12 days after the Christmas message, Nathan showed up at my front door unexpectedly, and the look on his face told me this conversation was going to change everything between us. Nathan stood in my kitchen that Saturday morning, looking more exhausted than angry. I had flour on my hands from making biscuits when he knocked, and somehow that ordinary little detail made the entire moment feel painfully human. No lawyers, no phone calls, just a father and son sitting across from each other at a kitchen table, finally saying things that should have been said years earlier. He admitted Diane's parents had convinced him that my financial help came with invisible strings attached. He admitted he'd started viewing every gift, every payment, every bit of support as a form of control instead of love. And the hardest part was, I understood why. Because I had spent years replacing emotional honesty with financial support. I made myself useful instead of vulnerable. Nathan stumbled through his apology awkwardly, repeating himself, struggling to explain emotions he clearly hadn't examined until now. But it was real. For the first time in years, it felt real. I told him I didn't want obedience from him. I wanted an actual relationship. One where we talked honestly instead of hiding behind money, pride, or silence. The house still went up for sale in January. That part didn't change. Nathan and Diane moved into a smaller rental by February, and for the first time in their marriage, they had to fully stand on their own financially. It was difficult, but it also forced them to grow. And strangely enough, once the money stopped controlling everything between us, our relationship finally had room to breathe. Now Nathan calls me just to talk sometimes. About work, about Elliot's soccer games, about Sophie drawing horses on every available surface in their house. And every now and then when the conversation gets quiet, I think about Pauline. I can almost hear her laughing softly beside me. Like she already knew this lesson would take me far too long to learn. If this story touched something in you, subscribe, because sometimes the people we love most don't truly find each other until after everything comfortable falls apart.